You've felt it for years. Something is off with the texture of modern life. The conversations feel shallower than they should. The urgency feels manufactured. The applause flows toward the loudest voices in the room, never the most thoughtful ones. You've watched less perceptive people get celebrated for ideas you saw through years ago. You've sat in meetings, in dinners, in entire relationships, watching the performance unfold around you, feeling like the only person in the room with the lights on. And every single time you've tried to name what you were seeing, someone has told you that you're overthinking, that you're being negative, that you're too sensitive, that you need to lighten up. But you weren't overthinking. You were observing. You were seeing the architecture beneath the noise, the script behind the smiles, the hollow center inside the celebrated. Carl Jung documented this exact pattern in his clinical work nearly a century ago. He gave it a name, a structure, a psychological mechanism. Today, you will finally have language for what you've been seeing. And once you have the language, you cannot be talked out of your perception ever again. Read that line again slowly, because that single sentence from Carl Jung is the key that unlocks a decade of confusion. What you've been feeling is not paranoia. It is not negativity. It is not some flaw in your personality that needs to be optimized out of you. It is awareness operating in an environment that is not designed to reward awareness. Modern culture is optimized for speed, volume, and emotional reactivity. Your nervous system is calibrated for depth, pattern recognition, and meaning. These two operating systems are not compatible, and you have spent years trying to translate one into the other, blaming yourself for the failure of the translation. Today, that ends, because the deep psychology Jung spent his life mapping reveals something the mainstream will never tell you, something the algorithm will never serve you, something the people in your life who keep telling you to lighten up will never understand. You were never the problem. Your awareness was never the problem. The problem is that you've been measuring the accuracy of your perception against a culture that no longer rewards perception, and that measurement was rigged from the start. Carl Jung saw this dynamic with clinical precision. He understood that the most psychologically intact individuals are often the ones the world quietly overlooks, not because they are deficient, but because they refuse to participate in the performance that gets people noticed. There is a profound difference between being rejected and being unrecognized. And that difference is the foundation of everything you are about to learn. By the end of this conversation, you will no longer wonder if you are too much, too deep, too aware. You will understand that what you have been suppressing is not a flaw, but a function. And that function, properly integrated, is the doorway to a kind of sovereignty almost no one in modern life ever reaches. You will walk away with a framework drawn from Jung's own work on individuation, a quiet philosophy of self-mastery, and one specific question Jung wrote that, once you internalize it, will reorganize how you experience every social situation for the rest of your life. This is not motivation, this is recognition. And recognition, once it arrives, cannot be unseen. If these ideas resonate with you, hit that subscribe button for more top-tier content. Also, drop a "seeing clearly" in the comments so I know you're ready. Let's dive in. Carl Jung had a phrase for the cultural condition you have been quietly noticing your entire adult life. He observed that every society generates what he called a collective psyche, a shared field of assumptions, rituals, and rewards that most people inherit without ever examining. And within that collective psyche, there is always a dominant frequency, a default setting, a kind of psychological tide that pulls people toward whatever requires the least internal effort. In our era, that tide pulls toward the immediate, the visible, the loud, and the emotionally reactive. It does not pull toward depth. It does not pull toward stillness. It does not pull toward the kind of patient internal observation you have been performing since you were old enough to notice that adults were lying to themselves. And here is the part almost no one will say out loud. The collective is not malicious. It is not conspiring against the perceptive. It is simply running on a different operating system, and operating systems that do not match do not register to one another. The aware are not punished by society. They are simply not noticed by a culture optimized for noise. There is a profound difference between those two states, and that difference is the beginning of your protection. When you understand that you have not been rejected, but rather unregistered, the wound begins to dissolve in real time. You stop interpreting the silence around your deeper observations as a verdict on their value. You start interpreting it accurately as the natural acoustic property of an environment tuned to a different bandwidth. Think about what that single reframing dissolves immediately. Every time someone glazed over when you brought up something meaningful, every time the room laughed at the surface joke and ignored the substantive insight you offered moments before, every time you watched a less thoughtful colleague get praised for a shallow idea while your sharper one was met with polite confusion and a quick change of subject, every time you came home from a social event feeling strangely emptied, unable to name why, because nothing technically went wrong, and yet something had been quietly subtracted from you. None of that was a referendum on your intelligence. None of it. It was the simple mechanical fact that depth has no antenna in a culture broadcasting on shallow. Carl Jung saw this dynamic with unflinching clarity. He understood that the collective rewards what reinforces the collective, and what reinforces the collective is rarely what challenges it to think. Your awareness challenges it to think. That is why your awareness has lived in a kind of quiet exile, not because something is wrong with you, but because something is fundamentally different in how you are processing reality, and that difference, properly understood, is not a wound. It is a resource. It is the raw material of sovereignty. The aware mind in the wrong environment will always feel defective. The same aware mind, properly oriented, becomes something almost mythological in its quiet effectiveness. But before you can orient it, you have to stop asking it to apologize for itself. You have to stop translating it down. You have to stop performing the dimming. There is a specific psychological move you have been performing, probably for most of your life, that has cost you more than you realize. Carl Jung called it adaptation to the persona, and in his clinical writing, he described it as one of the most subtle forms of self-betrayal a human being can commit. You learned, somewhere early, that the full bandwidth of your perception made people uncomfortable. You noticed too much. You said things that were too accurate. You read situations the rest of the room had not read yet. You asked questions that punctured the social membrane everyone else was tacitly agreeing to maintain. And the feedback you received, in 1,000 small ways, taught you that being fully perceptive in public was socially expensive. A teacher's frown, a parent's irritation, a friend's awkward laugh, a romantic partner's exhausted "please stop analyzing this." So you adapted. You learned to soften your observations. You learned to laugh at things you found hollow. You learned to nod along when someone celebrated an idea you could see straight through. You learned to dim, and the dimming worked in the short term. People liked you more. Social friction decreased. You fit in just enough to function. But underneath that dimming, a slow corrosion began. Because every time you dimmed your perception to match the room, you trained your own nervous system to distrust itself. You taught your awareness that it was a liability. You created an internal split between what you were actually seeing and what you were allowed to say, and Carl Jung knew exactly what that split produces over time. It produces fatigue that no amount of sleep can fix. It produces a low-grade depression that has no obvious cause and resists every external solution. It produces the strange experience of feeling invisible, even in rooms full of people who know your name. Because the version of you that is in the room is not the full you. It is the dimmed you, the acceptable you, the translated you, and the part of you that got left out, the discerning observer, the pattern reader, the one who sees the architecture, is sitting alone somewhere in the basement of your psyche, waiting to be invited back upstairs. Carl Jung's clinical work suggested something almost subversive in its implications. The most psychologically intact patients he encountered were often the ones the world had labeled difficult to read. They had stopped dimming. They had stopped performing the translation. They had reclaimed the full bandwidth of their awareness and accepted the social cost of that reclamation as the price of self-mastery. And what they discovered, almost without exception, was that the social cost was far smaller than they had feared. Because the dimming itself had been the source of most of their suffering, not the people around them. Stop and let that land. The dimming was the wound, not the world, not the shallow culture, not the unperceptive people who failed to see you. The dimming, the act of folding yourself smaller again and again to fit a container that was never going to honor what you were folding. This is the uncomfortable truth at the center of deep psychology. The exhaustion you feel in social situations is not caused by other people. It is caused by the enormous, invisible energy you spend hiding from them what you actually see. And the moment you stop spending that energy, an almost obscene amount of internal capacity returns to you. Sovereignty, in Carl Jung's framework, begins precisely there, not in some dramatic confrontation with society, not in cutting people off, not in moving to a cabin, not in any external gesture at all. In the quiet, internal decision to stop dimming, to let the observer come back into the room with you, to let your awareness operate at its native resolution, and to allow the social environment to respond, however it responds, without taking that response as a verdict on your worth. The dimming is a habit, and like every habit, it can be undone. But the undoing requires that you first see it for what it is, which is not humility, not politeness, not maturity, but a quiet, daily self-erasure that you were trained into before you had the capacity to consent to it. There is a single word at the center of Carl Jung's entire body of work, and it is the word that unlocks the next stage of what you are about to understand. The word is individuation. Carl Jung used it to describe the lifelong psychological process by which a person becomes who they actually are, as opposed to who they were trained to be. And here is the part of individuation that almost no popular summary captures, the part that most online interpretations of Carl Jung quietly miss. Individuation is not a process of becoming more. It is a process of becoming undivided. The word itself comes from the Latin root meaning indivisible. To individuate is to stop being split, to stop being the dimmed version in one room and the real version in private. To stop translating your awareness into shallower currency just to participate in conversations that do not deserve the translation. To stop having a public self and a private self that barely recognize each other anymore. Individuation is the slow, deliberate, often uncomfortable work of bringing every part of yourself, including the discerning observer you have been hiding, back under one roof. And Carl Jung was clear, almost severe on this point. Individuation is not undertaken by the majority. Most people will live and die inside the persona they constructed at 16 to survive social hierarchy. They will never meet the deeper intelligence inside them. They will never integrate the shadow function of their own perception. They will spend their entire lives optimizing the costume and never once removing it to see who is underneath. And Carl Jung did not say that with contempt. He said it with the clinical sorrow of a man who had watched it happen too many times to count. Most people will not individuate. not because they are incapable, but because the culture provides no incentive to do so, and the process itself is uncomfortable enough that without an internal pressure pushing them toward it, they will simply choose the persona for the rest of their lives. But you are not most people. The fact that you are still listening to this, the fact that you have felt the friction between your perception and your environment for years, the fact that something in you has refused, despite every social incentive to comply, to fully surrender to the dimming. That is itself the evidence that the individuation process has already begun in you. Something inside you has refused the full anesthesia. Something has kept watching. Something has kept reading the room, kept noticing the discrepancies, kept tracking the pattern that no one else seemed to be tracking. And the question now is what you do with the watcher. Because here is what Carl Jung observed across decades of clinical practice with patients who had taken individuation seriously. The individuated person is not louder. They are not more aggressive. They do not announce their awareness with declarations or posts or arguments. They simply, quietly, almost imperceptibly, stop apologizing for it. They develop what deep psychology and ancient philosophy both point toward as inner stillness, a quality of presence that does not require external validation because it has finally located its center of gravity inside itself. And from that inner stillness, an almost paradoxical thing emerges. They become more effective in the world, not less. Because the energy they used to spend dimming and translating and performing now flows into clarity, into discernment, into the quiet sovereignty that other people can feel in a room even when they cannot name what they are feeling. They cannot tell you why this person carries a different weight. They just know that something in the air shifts when this person speaks, even if this person speaks rarely. That is individuation made visible. That is the residue of self-mastery, of years of patient internal integration, of refusing the dimming for long enough that the original signal has come fully back online. This is the path Carl Jung mapped, not rebellion against the collective, not war with the shallow, not contempt for the unperceptive, just the patient, lifelong reclamation of every part of yourself that you had to abandon to fit in, brought home one piece at a time, room by room, conversation by conversation, until the inside and the outside of you finally match. And the most important piece for you, the piece that has been waiting longest, is the one you have been told most insistently to be quieter about: the seeing. Once you understand that your awareness was never the problem, the entire question shifts beneath your feet. The question is no longer, how do I become acceptable to the collective? The question becomes, how do I exist alongside the collective without spending myself trying to be seen by it? And here is where Carl Jung's deep psychology and the great traditions of ancient philosophy converge into something almost no modern self-help framework will give you. They converge on the principle of strategic detachment. Strategic detachment is not coldness, it is not bitterness, it is not the performance of indifference that people adopt when they have been hurt and want others to notice that they have been hurt. It is something far more refined, far more durable, far more useful. It is the deliberate philosophical decision to withdraw your emotional investment from outcomes that were never within your control to begin with, and to redirect that investment into the cultivation of your own interior. The collective will reward what the collective rewards. That is its function. You cannot change it through argument, through example, through frustration, through hope. And trying to change it has consumed more of your life energy than you would care to calculate if you sat down right now and did the math. Strategic detachment is the practice of letting the collective be what it is while you become what you are. In daily life, it looks like this. You stop offering depth to rooms that did not ask for it. You stop interpreting other people's failure to recognize your insight as a verdict on the insight itself. You stop seeking validation from frequencies that cannot receive your signal. You stop arguing with the shallow, not because the shallow are beneath you, but because the argument itself is a misallocation of your most finite resource, which is attention. Attention is the only true currency in the individuation process. Every unit of attention you spend trying to be understood by people who are not trying to understand is a unit of attention you have stolen from your own becoming. Read that twice, because that single principle, internalized, will recover years of your life that you did not know you had been losing. Carl Jung understood this with surgical precision. He observed that the individuated person develops what we might call selective availability. They are present, fully, generously, almost luxuriously, for the conversations and relationships that meet them at depth. And they are politely, gracefully, immovably unavailable for the ones that do not. This is not arrogance, it is allocation. It is the recognition that your inner life is a resource, and resources that are spent indiscriminately produce nothing, while resources that are spent strategically produce everything. The aware mind, properly trained, learns to move through the collective without being absorbed by it. You attend the meeting, you have the dinner, you make the small talk, you laugh at the appropriate moments, you participate in the surface as fully as the situation requires. And none of it touches the center of you, because the center of you is doing something else entirely. The center of you is watching, integrating, refining, building, and the people around you cannot tell, because strategic detachment is invisible. It does not announce itself. It does not need to. It simply produces, slowly, day by day, year by year, the kind of life that the loud and the shallow will spend their entire existence chasing without ever reaching. The composure, the clarity, the unhurried quality of someone who is no longer measuring themselves against a frequency they were never meant to match. There is an old principle in philosophy that ancient thinkers across multiple traditions arrived at independently. The freest person in any room is the one who needs nothing from anyone in it. Strategic detachment is the modern, practical expression of that principle. You walk into the room needing nothing, not approval, not recognition, not agreement, not understanding. You walk in carrying your own center with you, and because you carry it, no one can take it. They cannot withhold what you are not asking for. They cannot diminish what you have stopped offering up for evaluation. The aware mind that has learned strategic detachment becomes, in a quiet way, untouchable, not invincible, not superior, untouchable. There is a difference, and the difference is the whole point. Before we close, I told you there was one specific question from Carl Jung's work that, once you internalize it, will reorganize how you experience every social situation for the rest of your life. Here it is, distilled from his writings on individuation and the relationship between the persona and the deeper self. The question is this: what in me is asking to be seen by this situation, and what in me is being called to simply observe it? Read that slowly. Read it 3 times if you have to, because that single distinction is the entire framework of sovereign awareness compressed into one inquiry. Most of your social exhaustion has come from confusing those 2 modes. You walked into rooms with the part of you that was asking to be seen, and the room was not equipped to see it. So the part of you that wanted recognition came home empty again and again and again, and you interpreted that emptiness as a personal failure. You thought, if I were a little smarter, a little funnier, a little more charming, a little less intense, they would have finally seen me. But that was never the equation. The equation was that you brought the seeking part of yourself into rooms that could only register the observing part, and you mistook the rooms for the verdict. There was another part of you in all of those rooms, however, the discerning observer, the pattern reader, the one who was actually doing the meaningful work without any acknowledgement. And that part of you was never asking to be seen. That part of you was there to watch, to learn, to gather data, to refine its model of human nature, of social architecture, of the strange recurring dynamics that govern how people actually behave underneath what they say. And when you let that part of you take the lead in a social situation, something profound happens. The exhaustion stops almost immediately, because you are no longer in the room seeking, you are in the room observing. And observation, unlike seeking, is not depletable, it is generative. It feeds you instead of draining you. Every shallow conversation becomes a study. Every performative ritual becomes a data point. Every person who fails to see your depth becomes information about the frequency they are operating on. Information you can then use to allocate your future attention with surgical precision. The room that used to drain you now teaches you. The dinner that used to leave you hollow now leaves you with a notebook full of insight. The colleague whose behavior used to confuse and frustrate you becomes a living case study in the very dynamics Carl Jung spent his life cataloging. This is what self-mastery looks like at the level of daily life. It is not dominance over others. It is not victory in arguments. It is not the construction of some impressive external persona. It is the quiet internal reassignment of which part of you is leading the encounter. The seeking part stays home, the observing part goes out. And the observing part, Carl Jung knew, is the part of you that is closest to what he called the self, capital S, the integrated center of your psyche, the place where the dimming has finally ended and the original signal has come fully back online. To live from that center is to have access to a kind of inner stillness that no external chaos can disturb. People will still misread you. The shallow will still be rewarded. The culture will still broadcast on a frequency you do not match. The collective will continue to be the collective, as it has been for every aware mind in every era of recorded history. None of that changes. What changes is that none of it touches the center of you anymore, because the center of you is no longer in the marketplace. The center has come home. And once the center has come home, it does not willingly go back out to be evaluated by frequencies that were never going to register it accurately. That is sovereignty, not power over others. Sovereignty over the territory of your own attention. And once you taste it, the dimming becomes impossible. Not difficult, impossible. Because the part of you that used to perform the dimming has finally remembered what it was built for, which was never to fit in. It was to see. So here is where you stand now. You walked in carrying a decade of accumulated confusion about why your awareness seemed to cost you more than it earned you. Why the world seemed to reward what you found hollow. Why every attempt to bring your full perception into a room left you more depleted than the time before. You walked in wondering, somewhere quietly underneath your competence and your composure, if there was something defective in the way you process reality, and you are walking out with a different map entirely. You are not too much. You are not too deep. You are not overthinking. You are an aware mind operating in a cultural environment that is not optimized to reward awareness. And the friction you have been feeling all these years is not evidence of your dysfunction. It is evidence of your accuracy. Carl Jung mapped this entire dynamic with the precision of a man who had watched it quietly ruin too many intelligent lives that never received the language for what was happening to them. You have the language now, and with the language comes a choice that nobody else can make for you. You can continue to dim. You can keep translating yourself into shallower currency for rooms that were never going to value the depth of the original. You can keep seeking recognition from frequencies that cannot receive your signal, and keep interpreting their silence as a verdict on your worth. Or you can begin the slow, dignified, lifelong work of individuation, the reclamation of every part of yourself you had to set down to fit in, the patient practice of strategic detachment, the philosophical art of being present in the world without being consumed by it, the daily application of Carl Jung's question in every room you enter. What in me wants to be seen here, and what in me is here to observe? And the willingness, again and again, to let the observer lead. Drop the words "seeing clearly" in the comments below. Not as a slogan, not as a performance, as a private acknowledgement to yourself that the dimming is over, that the discerning observer is finally coming home, that you are done apologizing for the bandwidth at which you process reality. This space exists for the small, dignified fraternity of aware minds who have grown quietly tired of explaining themselves to a culture that was never going to understand. If that is you, subscribe. Stay close. Because what we explore here is not motivation. It is not surface psychology. It is not the shallow currency the algorithm rewards in every other corner of this platform. It is the deep psychology of sovereignty, the philosophy of inner stillness, the cultivation of the self-mastery that almost no one in modern life is even taught to want, let alone how to build. And whatever you do, do not stop now. The video already loading on your screen is the next movement of this same arc, and it matters more than you currently realize. It picks up exactly where this conversation has left a door open inside you, and it walks you through that door. Trust me, you do not want to miss it. I will see you there. See what others miss. Know what others fear. Become who others can't.